Welcome back, class. Let's go ahead and get started. So we just recently left off talking about personality, and now we're going to be examining another aspect of how personality develops by looking at learning approaches. Learning approaches focus only on observable, unlike the hidden influences of the Freudians, which we reviewed earlier. We'll look at the behavioral perspective, the social cognitive perspective, and Julian Rotter and locus of control. So, the behavioral perspective and the social cognitive perspective. First, the behavioral perspective, as proposed by B.F. Skinner, which we've talked about previously. Personality is significantly shaped by the reinforcement and consequences outside of the organism. Personality develops throughout one's entire life, unlike Freud's view. So the notion here is this: learning has a great role in how it is that we behave. And as we talked about, personality is that consistent way in which we feel, think, and behave. So obviously, what we learn and reinforcements and punishments will have some role to play in the personality that develops in an individual. We won't go over the details again because we've talked about that previously before, looking at reinforcement and punishments, whether we add or introduce something or something is removed. But review that just to make sure you understand the basic premise. But what we're talking about here is simply saying that behavioral perspective, such as reinforcements and punishers, they have a significant role in developing the personality that we develop and experience in our day-to-day life. Then we have social cognitive perspective proposed by Albert Bandura. Here he emphasizes both learning, as we saw with Skinner, and cognition, how we think about things, bringing up such concepts as reciprocal determinism, observational learning, and self-efficacy all play a part in personality development. Julian Rotter and locus of control. Locus of control referring to your belief as to where the power comes over our life. Do we possess the power ourselves, or do the power come from outside of us as an individual? Meaning, basically, do other things outside of us control the course of our life, or do we control the course of our life? If you believe you are in control, you have an internal locus of control. I am in control of outcomes. Belief that one's efforts and decisions determines those outcomes is an internal locus of control. An external locus is basically outcomes are beyond my personal control. This suggests a belief in luck or fate. Other people or individuals, like the man or whatever, they determine the outcomes of one's life. Think about what this means by way of one's personality, how it is that they consistently behave or think about things. If someone believes that their life is controlled by external focus, that will dictate to some extent how they behave. They may be less likely to try to take things in their own hands, so to speak, or to put a great deal of effort in trying to control things because it's ridiculous. They know the locus of control for their life is not them, it's external to them. Whereas someone who has an internal locus of control, they're more likely to try to take personal responsibility and try to do things to achieve certain objectives. So here we see how locus of control and your belief as to where the power lies will have a great deal of impact on how we behave, how we act, how we think, and how we feel. Consequently, has an impact on one's personality. Then we have humanistic approaches. Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. We've talked about these individuals before. Maslow examined the priority of needs or the hierarchy of needs, basically saying that some needs are more important than others. We look at the triangle on the left bottom there. We see the physiological needs. That must be met before we worry about safety needs. Safety needs must be met before we worry about love and belonging needs, and so on and so forth. All right? So self-actualization at the top of that little pyramid is when we achieve the ability to live up to our own potential as a person. So looking at Carl Rogers, one of Rogers' main ideas about personality regards the self-concept, our thoughts and feelings about ourselves. The ideal self is the person that you would like to be. The real self is the person that you actually are. Rogers was very interested in the congruence, how much they overlap, for example. Congruence when our thoughts about our real self and our ideal self are very similar. Let's say your self-image and your ideal self are not similar. There's very little overlap. The self-image is different from the ideal self. There's only a little overlap. Then that person would have difficulty trying to achieve self-actualization. But if we look from another perspective, if there's a lot of overlap between your self-image of what you really are like and your ideal self you would like to be, if the self-image is similar to the ideal self, there's more overlap and the person has a great deal more ability to become self-actualized. So this will dictate how it is that we behave. What are we trying to accomplish based on these perspectives? What our needs currently are, what our self-concept is, will then indeed play a role in how our personality plays out. Then we have the biological approaches. Heritability refers to the portion of difference among people that is attributed to genetics. This is that nature-nurture question that we've talked about before. Nature basically saying you are who you are based on what you have inherited, heritability, inherited from your parents, the genetics. Nurture says that we are who we are based on what we have experienced as we go through our life. Now, temperament, which we've discussed previously in a previous lecture, is most contemporary psychologists believe this temperament has a biological basis. And the reason behind this is very simple. We see temperament evidence early in one's life. We can tell this one baby, this one newborn is highly excitable. This other newborn, maybe their brother even, this other newborn seems to be more laid back. All right? So the temperament, we didn't have an opportunity to learn it. We see it displayed so early in our life, therefore most likely there's a biological reason to why it is that we behave this way or display these types of traits in our personality. Sheldon proposed three somatotypes a long time ago: endomorphs, mesomorphs, and ectomorphs. And basically the idea was that body type will dictate your personality. And of course, this is very stereotypical thinking, and the research does not support this at all. For example, one would say someone who's overweight may tend to be jolly and gregarious. This is not what the research holds out. Then we have trait theorists. Trait theorists believe personality can be understood via the approach that all people have certain traits. A trait is a characteristic way of behaving. Cattell in 1957 identified 16 factors or dimensions of personality: warmth, reasoning, rule, consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, and so on and so forth. The idea is that we can measure individuals' traits using simple surveys and tools such as that, and get an idea of how they would behave. You may have noticed, if you've been looking for work over the last few years, that you may have been asked to fill out a survey. Oftentimes these surveys are very much a personality style type of survey, trying to get at certain types of ways in which you characteristically behave. By doing this, they're able to figure out how you might behave in employment with their organization. It's also been seen in research that certain people in certain types of careers share similar traits with other people in the same career, but different traits from people in a very divergent or very different style or type of career. So there's evidence in support for these trait theorists and measuring traits to get some idea of how people may behave in employment scenarios. The Eysenck again described two factors to account for variations in our personalities: extroversion, introversion, which we've talked about briefly during this lecture, and emotional stability and instability. Using a similar type of thing that we saw previous segment, we can see it laid out here. Now, for years and years, they did loads of research on personality. And then they started to see a theme go throughout all this personality research that was being done. They started to see certain traits which were consistently being uncovered. And these traits would later be called the Big Five or the five-factor model. So each person has 5 traits, each scored on a continuum from high to low. In the center column, notice that the first letter of each trait spells the mnemonic ocean. So ocean, O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. So you could score an individual on each one of these factors to get some idea of their personality, how they would tend to behave in a variety of types of situations. Ocean is just one way to look at this. There are many other ways too, but this is just one way that's been arranged as a mnemonic device. And then we have cultural understandings of personality. What the cultural understanding of personality is a very simple idea. Researchers found 3 distinct regional personality types across and clustered in the United States. Here we go. People tend to be friendly and conventional in the upper Midwest and deep South. Relaxed, emotionally stable, and creative in the West. And stressed and irritable and depressed in the Northeast. So what we see here is the ability to say that when you go to certain regions where people, part of their culture may dictate how it is that they may behave and act and feel and think. And of course what this is suggesting is this: by this region they tend to share or have certain types of personality clusters in those particular regions. And finally, we have the idea of personality in individualist and collectivist cultures. People who live in individualistic cultures tend to believe that independence, competition, and personal achievement are important. We live in an individualistic culture, by the way. People who live in a collectivist culture value social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs over individual needs. So what we can see in essence here is this: certain cultures seem to suggest certain personality types, because the cultures can greatly influence how individuals think, feel, and behave. And if they are influencing thinking, feeling, and behaving, they are obviously influencing personality. There are 3 approaches that can be used to study personality in a cultural context. We have cultural comparative approach, the indigenous approach, these are the people who live in a certain area, and that's where they live, and the combined approach, looking at a cross between the cultural as well as the indigenous approach to incorporate elements of both.